So in this video, we're going to explore what happens when a couple who sets up a living trust gets divorced. What happens to the trust and the terms and the assets that are involved. All right, so it's really common. Many couples, married couples, are around America set up joint revocable living trusts, and they do it for a number of reasons. Maybe 3 of those reasons include they want to arrange their legal affairs so that probate is avoided when each one of them passes away, and all of the court and attorney involvement that goes with probate is avoided. 2, they may want to provide for each other a certain way. When one spouse dies, they may want to leave assets a certain way for the other. And then they also, 3, want to provide for what happens after both spouses pass away, how the assets will be dispersed, who's going to be in charge of all of that. So those are 3 of the reasons why married couples establish what we call revocable living trusts. However, sometimes couples set up a trust and then subsequent to their establishing the trust and transferring their assets to their trust, they get divorced. So in this video, we're going to explore what happens when that happens and what happens to the trust and its assets. So my first response is we have to look to the terms of the trust and see if the trust terms address what happens if the couple gets divorced. And I'll tell you, there's a couple of provisions that are commonly found in joint revocable living trusts. A common provision might say something like upon, and here I'm in Louisiana. This is a community property state. There's 8 or 9 community property states in the United States, but we use the community property lingo in our joint revocable living trusts. So many trusts will say something like upon the termination of the community between the settlors, which means if the couple who sets up the trust gets divorced, upon the termination of the community between the settlors, the trustee shall divide the trust into 2 new separate trusts according to the settlors' ownership in the community and separate property. Okay, so that's one provision that says, hey, if the couple gets divorced, divide up the trust assets, and if it was David and Deidre getting divorced, divide assets up into the David Trust and the Deidre Trust. And then there's typically another provision that addresses the question that we often get is, if I transfer my separate property to our joint trust, does my separate property lose its separate property status and become community by transferring my separate property to our joint revocable living trust? It's a mouthful, but stay with me here. So most trusts, at least in community property states, have a provision that says the transfer of assets to this trust by a settlor does not alter the separate or community property status of any such assets had prior to the transfer. So again, going back to David and Deidre, let's say they were a married couple. They wanted to set up their living trust. Deidre had 1,000 shares of stock that she had inherited from her father, and she puts that into the David and Deidre joint revocable living trust. 3 years later, they get divorced. Well, because that 1,000 shares of stock was clearly Deidre's separate property when she put it into the trust, it retains its separate property status in the trust. So when that divorce occurs or that termination of the community occurs, Deidre's going to get that 1,000 shares of stock back and put into her trust in accordance with the first provision that I went over with you that says that the trustee shall divide the trust into 2 new separate trusts according to the settlor's ownership in the community and separate property. All right, so just to see how it all plays out, let's go over it. David and Deidre set up their joint revocable living trust. They put their home in the trust. They have some investments together that they put in the trust. They may have another piece of land or a camp or a condo that they put in the trust. Deidre has her 1,000 shares of stock that she inherited from her father. She puts that in the trust. They get divorced 2 years, 3 years, 10 years later. So the trust gets, the joint trust goes away, and then there's going to be a David trust and a Deidre trust. Deidre's separate 1,000 shares of stock will go into the Deidre trust. The other assets, a 1/2 interest will go into the Deidre trust, a 1/2 interest will go into the David trust, unless I suppose there's some community property settlement that alters that they would both agree to, in the community property settlement. So hope that gives you some idea of what happens when a couple who sets up a trust gets divorced. It's unfortunate when we see that happen, but it does happen. Another really important aspect to note as part of all of this is you got to smash the like button, and that way the YouTube algorithms will keep you informed every time I make a new estate planning YouTube video. And oh, by the way, maybe even more important, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell that's attached to it. All right, we'll see you next time.